We are thrilled to present this exhibition of new photographs by native Shinnecock artist Jeremy Dennis. He is a local to the island. He went to high school here at the Russ High School in East Hampton, did his BFA at Stony Brook in 2013, and completed his MFA at Penn State in 2016. He's done a number of shows across the nation in the last few years. He's a young artist, but he's racking up a number of exhibitions. Shows in New York, Chicago, the West Coast, points in between. Has received a number of awards in recent years, including a recent residency at the Vermont Studio Center, a Getty Creative Bursar Fellowship, which was just awarded this year. We received news after the catalog went to print, so it's not listed in the accolades there, as well as a Center for Photography residency at Woodstock, New York. He's had, as I mentioned, numerous group exhibitions across the country and recent solo exhibitions at the Guildhall in East Hampton and at the Suffolk County Historical Society. He's also, I understand, a recent recipient of a Stony Brook Alumni Award, the 40 Under 40 Award. Correct. I'd like to say a few words about how this show came together. I started working with the Center for Social Justice a couple of years ago in conversation about ideas for creating more exhibitions that are more focused on issues of social justice in the gallery. This initiative happened, really about November 2016. This is about when I became motivated that we needed to start doing this a little bit more actively and a little bit more often. And I want to thank Jill Santiago and Renee Ortiz from the Center for Social Justice for recommending Jeremy to me. This is how I was introduced to his work and how we got together. I also want to say a few more words of thanks before I turn the floor over to Jeremy, and maybe a few words of my own thoughts about the show and what moves me about it. The first is I want to thank Jeremy. Putting a show together like this is a pretty monumental act. It takes months to generate, curate, discuss, build the catalog, and there are, dozens of sessions of phone calls and communications and meetings. He has been totally pro. I mean, I can't believe how quickly he responds to me when I have questions about any aspect of the show. There have been days when I thought that he does not leave his computer. Like he's there all the time. And, on the drop of a hat, the ability to send a huge resized file to a printer or me or someone else 6 or 7 or 8 different times throughout the week. You can't do these things from your phone. I don't know. He's on the ball. So I've been impressed, and I want to say thanks so much for that. It's been really a pleasure to work with you. I also would be remiss if I didn't say thanks to all the people that make the shows happen. Maria Cherubino, Art Department Secretary, does a tremendous service for the gallery, and it can't be understated. I have a great staff here in the gallery, including Keeks, President at the desk, Brian Rooney, Anna Prikaz-Chikova, and Scott Cole. Again, I want to thank Renee and Jill for working with us to put this show together, and as always, I want to thank Dean Lundberg, Dean Sprouse, Dean Bartolotta, and Charlie Whitrich, as well as the Suffolk County Association for supporting and funding what we do here. So when Jill and Renee sent the work to me, they sent me a few images, and I went to Jeremy's website, and there were 3 or 4 different series of works that really, they knocked me over. It was an immediate response that I had that the work was particularly striking and poignant and suited to our moment in history. This particular body of work, which is titled Nothing Happened Here, I felt transported into the role of the subject when looking at this work. I felt my own part in the greater picture of post-colonialism in the West, and I felt part of the privileged legacy of that history, and I felt that this work needed to be shared to hopefully communicate and impart those kinds of emotions to the students here at the college and anyone from the community that can come and visit the show. We do have a pretty active distribution program for the catalogs, and I don't like to really talk about irons that are still in the fire, but I will, just to mention that we're working actively to try to travel this show to a number of other venues across the country, university and college galleries, as well as possibly a few commercial venues. So we're excited to see this show grow legs, travel far and wide, and we are certainly excited to present it here to you today. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Jeremy, who's going to talk about the work for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a question and answer session. Sound good?
Thank you everyone for having me here. I have about 15-20 minutes of notes that I'd like to make sure I cover everything to give this work a little bit of context and kind of a purpose and motivation behind it. So hopefully you'll be patient if I check my notes a little bit. First of all, I want to say thanks to Jill Santiago and Renee Ortiz from the Social Justice and Human Understanding Department, and Matthew Gehring, of course, for all the work we've done to make this possible, and all of his patience and help that he's provided all along the way. And thanks to Jesus, if he's here today, for helping me carry in the crates when I arrived. I don't know if he's here today, but I also want to recognize the Harpo Foundation, who funded my Vermont Studio Center residency in June 2016, and also the Saltonstall Artist Residency in Ithaca, New York, where I produced and directed many of these photographs. So I wanted to thank them. And also to Steve Locke, who during my Vermont Studio Center residency, we had a studio visit, and during that time I didn't really know if this work was even possible in my mind or if it were worth pursuing. But after a 20-minute conversation, he made it one of my priorities during my month there. This project began to form in 2015 while attending Pennsylvania State University in my graduate program, after reading texts, for example, by Zizek on violence, and Noam Chomsky's interviews and texts on very blunt issues between indigenous communities and settler communities in America. My goal was to absorb these methods of decolonization and express that idea within my visual practice. Each time the process of decolonization is mentioned, there's always a description of violence, not of course of physical violence, but of disruption of cultural norms and trying to change the way that we might have biases towards each other or prejudices. Simply put, in my mind and what I try to pursue in my art practice is to draw attention to important matters that often go unnoticed. I brought a book with me today titled We're Still Here by John Strong, who for many decades was both a professor and anthropologist for the Shinnecock people and also for the tribes of Long Island and New England. And I wanted to share this title because this title, We're Still Here, kind of embodies the whole idea of this project. What I wanted to mention is that many anthropologists and indigenous scholars and artists try to portray this idea that indigenous people are still here among us today, contrary to what we might believe in popular culture and how we're represented. With this motivation, I wanted these portraits to portray a tension of knowing, but trying to suppress the idea that we're still here. I believe that the images could be a feature for both indigenous models and non-indigenous models. People often jokingly ask if I hate white people, and of course that's not very true. These are all people that I admire fondly, and I hope they never are impaled by arrows, of course. This lack of understanding and acknowledgement can lead to a lacking confidence within our identity within, for example, the Shinnecock community. Growing up and not knowing our history made it difficult to create a convincing argument for our heritage and our still presence on Long Island, New York. During the past year, I've done research for a project titled On This Site, which allowed me to travel and document indigenous history on Long Island and presenting it in a way where it's site-based, trying to suggest the idea that even though most of us see history in a timeline, we can still visit the sites of these important histories and be reminded of these important narratives and contributions and conflicts and things that I felt were kind of forgotten or overlooked because many people might see indigenous people as a long past culture. The project on this site is available on my website if you're curious about it. From a critical perspective resulting from the research, I think that the lack of attention given to this history, even for residents of Long Island who are neighbors to the Shinnecock and Uncoshog reservations and other tribal communities, is parallel with the misunderstanding that Native people died and assimilated long ago. Therefore, one might think that this type of history and knowledge is irrelevant to the present. To counter this argument, I think a discussion on national identity is essential now, recognizing that we have a very divided political population. In my own cultural research, for example, knowledge from the far past has made me realize the importance of community and how origins determine our goals and ambitions in life. Without knowing that, even the motivation going day to day is obscured. Going to the photos that are presented behind me, I think this very expression is captured in each image, the seeming lack of motivation. To push that further, I wanted the arrows to represent indigenous or Native American people and our bodies, the idea that we're present and persistent. These figures are impaled by the arrows, but it's not known if they're aware of that or not. At first, I thought that representing us and our bodies is reinforcing of the primitive idea of Native people, but comparing the silhouettes of Kerouac's work, the arrows for me were symbols of people that we have in our mind but could never truly be simplified to. There's another series I'd like to work on, based on indigenous myths. Shooting in Pennsylvania, there weren't many indigenous communities or other students who were from Native American backgrounds, and I wanted to continue my portraiture practice, which I love to work on, but of course I couldn't really seek out other people who were from that same background. So I wanted to find out a way where I can still continue portraiture, and this project became that idea. Well, going back to the arrows as a violent element, I thought that the arrows would be a great substitute for our presence in a otherwise unavailable population or community nearby. Showing some of the images early on, people immediately recognize the images as an American versus indigenous theme. And on Long Island and elsewhere in America, there's a long legacy of the Indian being seen as a violent culture or people, which I thought was less about an actuality and more about our once legacy as a numerous people who had cohesion and a contrast between the settler community. I came up with the title Nothing Happened Here around halfway through shooting, but when I began the project and even more this year, there have been many important conversations about historical white guilt in America. For example, the monuments being removed, Dana Schultz's Emmett Till painting, and football team mascots, and a polarizing battle between national identity. Even if you still see indigenous people in America as a long-gone culture, I hope that the arrows represent our shared history, calling for you to learn it and inform who you are. Thank you. I hope that there's some questions I can answer now. I appreciate it.
I have a question.
Of course.
I'm assuming that these things are very mindfully done by you, and some of the images, the feathers are especially beautiful, and in others they are particularly beautiful. Is there any meaning to that?
Well, when I began this project at the Vermont Studio Center, it's a very unique opportunity where you're surrounded by around 40 other artists, and during that month, I developed a very close relationship with those people, and I was trying to convince them at the same time for me to impale them violently with arrows, but I also admire them personally. So of course I have this conflict within this work and all of my work of both flattering the subject while also trying to maintain that idea that I don't really want this to be the reality between us.
I have a question. looking at the arrows, it appears that they're added in post-production, right? In addition to that being logistically easier than big fake arrows glued or something, is there also a more artistic reason that you did that? Do you think the fact that the arrows are not physically real has any meaning for you, as opposed to if they were physically real and they were done as props?
I do get the technical question a lot of how are the arrows actually being held in the air. Of course, these people are deceased now. Well, mentioning the Indigenous Myth series, there's this figure called the Trickster who's most often is characterized as by playing tricks on people, appearing like he's not there. And relating to the subject of the series, Nothing Happened Here, what I had to do for each image was set the camera on a tripod, and I physically held every single arrow that you see in the images. There's no kind of like body suit holding the arrows in place or no strings. So I think it kind of embodies that idea that I'm persistent and present in each image, but I'm just erasing myself in Photoshop. And that process kind of embodies nothing happened here, yet I'm here holding the arrows. So thanks for answering.
It's very interesting.
I noticed on the third painting on the left with the guy on the bridge, is there a reason why the arrows haven't hit him yet compared to all the other pictures?
This project has been going on for more than a year, and I wanted to somehow conclude the series. Maybe there's a way that these arrows represent maybe an obscurity, whether or not they know that they're there, but I wanted to also represent how did they get there and how do we remove them. So I keep wondering if maybe the setting or their activity could resolve their acknowledgement or some sort of healing. And I think that this type of event and conversation can lead to that kind of removal of the arrow and that pain that's shared in two communities.
If I just make a statement, I was born in Huntington on what I call Shinnecock land, because the Shinnecock tribe lived there, or people lived there. In my town, there is a statue of Christopher Columbus holding a flag and holding a sword. In my town, there on the village green, there is a stone with a plaque from the Sons of Italy that says, near here, the settlers built a blockhouse or fort house to protect themselves from the Indians or savages. I forget the wording. I never knew as a white guy until years later that when Columbus met the Taino, and I don't know how many people know this, in Dominica, if I have this right, the native people rode out to him. They were happy to see him. They greeted him. They said, hey, here's some food. Let's hang out together. And he wrote in his journal, they were a very simple, interesting people. How amazing and how kind they were. What great slaves they would make. And that's his diary. Okay. And as a white guy, I went, snap. You know, what is that? What is that about cultures that we view our ability to say, we can take you, we can have you, we can take your land. So I began my statement by saying, I live on Shinnecock land. In my heart, it is still Shinnecock land. That's just me, okay? But I just want to say thank you so much, and thank you to the gallery, because there's teaching here that is going on some very deep levels. And when we begin to look at that heritage that I have as an Anglo-Irish, English-German dude that arrived here, and your people who greeted Henrik Hudson, your people who greeted Verenzano and others, I just want to say thank you, because to have you share your vision is a gift. So thank you.
I do want to mention, in relation to Shinnecock, we do have one of their tribal members here, Tecumseh Caesar. Maybe you two should communicate. But I think that's wonderful that you brought that up, and Tecumseh is here because the whole point of this exhibition is just to represent us and our presence. So I think that's a wonderful conclusion to the talk. Any more questions? Or?
I think that might be a good place to segue. I want to just mention, to close this off, to bring it to conclusion, that in the catalog, in my director's forward, there is a bit of history kind of ancient history and also recent history that's relevant to the Shinnecock Nation, Long Island, and the exhibition. I want to encourage everyone to pick up a copy. They're free to everyone. And hopefully you will be as moved as I was by the discoveries in the research. I'll leave it there. I'll leave it at that for you to peruse and decide. I also want to say, dovetailing onto your comments, that this is a teaching situation. And I've always viewed the gallery as a teaching tool. I think that although we have seen so many atrocities, and we continue to see in our contemporary news feeds atrocities, think about the slashing of the land recently at Bears Ears and Grand Escalante National Monuments, or what has happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota. It's sort of amazing that we are where we are, but I do think that because we can have this platform to communicate these concerns, that we are in an optimistic time, as dark as they can seem from time to time, especially when we tune into the 6 o'clock news. In conclusion, I just want to say, soak it up. Take a catalog, read what you can, reflect on these things and how you can play a part in advancing social change. I think that's what we do as artists. It's our primary job. We are catalysts for consideration, for change and advancement of all sorts of disenfranchised groups and ideas in this culture. So thank you again for coming, and enjoy the show.